All right, the situation in Venezuela seemed to be cooling down after opposition leader Juan Guaido's failed coup last week. Or did it? The U.S. immediately accused Cuba and Russia of meddling. And then on Friday, President Trump spent an hour on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Among the things they discussed was Venezuela, of course, where hundreds of Russian soldiers are stationed along with Russian missile systems there. Now, over the weekend, talks took place between Russian and Venezuelan foreign ministers. Today, Guaido's back, again, inviting U.S. military intervention. Pompeo, meanwhile, says he won't promise to consult Congress before launching a potential attack. And the Venezuelan embassy here in D.C., well, it continues to be under siege by Guaido supporters. For more on this, we're turning now to investigative journalist Ben Swann. So, Ben, Guaido is back from hiding after this failed coup. He's again calling on U.S. military intervention. Pompeo says he's not going to talk to Congress if they decide to launch an attack. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's obviously a huge problem. I mean, obviously, you have the Secretary of State saying he doesn't need to talk to Congress, even though someone needs to get him a copy of the Constitution, because clearly, constitutionally, he does need to. The president needs to go to Congress in order to do this. And this, by the way, does not fall under this vastly broad use of military force, right? The authorization of use of military force, the AUMF that was passed after September 11th, that essentially has been used to wage the so-called war on terror. It's essentially why presidents like George W. Bush and Barack Obama and President Trump have not used congressional approval to involve themselves in continued bombings in the Middle East, because they say, well, it's all part of the war on terror. The Venezuela situation is entirely different. So you can't even make that very, very thin stretch to say, well, we could do it here in Venezuela because it's under that AUMF. It's absolutely not. And so Congress actually needs to step up right now and fulfill its constitutional responsibility and say you will not use military force in Venezuela without congressional approval, period.
Right. And now Pompeo and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, are due to meet in Finland to discuss the situation. No word yet on what's going to come of that. So obviously, right, Russia is backing Maduro. We know that. What does Russia have to gain here by backing Maduro?
So there are a couple of issues here. Number one, I think Russia is doing it because, in part, Russia sees an opportunity to back another fairly large country where the U.S. is attempting to overthrow and create regime change, and in part because of the oil resources there. We know that oil and natural gas is a huge part of the Russian economy. Russia depends heavily on that. And so any disruption that's created in Venezuela directly affects them. It also affects Russia in terms of the use of American oil companies going there and trying to take advantage of it. But I think there's a bigger issue here, too. You know, if you consider what happened in Ukraine and how the U.S. got so involved in Ukraine and accusing Russia of wanting to overthrow Ukraine and encroaching into Ukraine, I think there's a lot of bad blood there in terms of this ever-expanding empire, and that Russia's angry about it and wants to be able to intervene here on behalf of Maduro. But what's really fascinating was Mike Pompeo on the Sunday talk shows this week, getting up and saying that they are sick and tired of the Russians involving themselves and the Cubans involving themselves and the Iranians involving themselves. And his words, he says, we want all foreign nations to get out of Venezuela and stop associating with Venezuela and just let, essentially democracy happen there. Well, how does that not include the United States? I mean, the United States has no authority to be in Venezuela doing what it's doing to create regime change. So if the Russians leave, the Iranians leave, the Cubans leave, everybody's out, the U.S. should get out of it too. But that's not the way they see it. They see it as the U.S. should continue to be involved, continue to prop up this so-called leader of Venezuela, and everybody else should get out.
And Ben, as you know, I'm sure you've seen all the images, another battle happening here locally in downtown D.C. There are activists on either side of the situation at the Venezuelan embassy. Activists inside say Venezuela is working on a deal with an undisclosed country to restore embassy services to those who want to travel, et cetera, those with family, medical needs, what have you. What might be the best solution here? And is there anything, you think, anything illegal going on? Because, the activists that want to keep I don't want to say they're all pro-Maduro, but they're anti-interventionist on the inside, and then the Guaido supporters on the outside. But there are tons of civilians that just need embassy services. So what now?
Right, because this is part of the problem, right? Part of the problem is that the United States has officially declared that the Maduro government is not a legitimate government, that the Guaido government is a legitimate government. That's why they wouldn't even recognize, when you used the term, it was a failed coup last week, and it absolutely was a failed coup. The U.S. government won't acknowledge that because they say it can't be a coup because Guaido is the rightful authority there, and therefore, you know, any of the embassy services in the United States related to Venezuela all have to go through Guaido and his people because he's the rightful leader, not Maduro. And what you're essentially doing is creating a disaster for so many people who need access to that country, whose family members are in that country. Look, the whole thing is a mess right now, but it's not a mess because it's so black and white as Maduro's bad and the U.S. and Guaido are good. And you know that and I know that, right? Just in terms of looking at the story, the reality is the U.S. has decided it's going to impose its own leader and overthrow the government of Venezuela. That is not an endorsement on my part of the current government of Venezuela. However, it does not make the situation better to now create all these situations of unrest and disruption for the everyday lives of millions of people who are in Venezuela because the U.S. has decided who they want running the country. And we have seen this play out, Manila, so many times before, over and over and over again, and it never ends well. And the idea that we're going to continue to do this and eventually get a different result, I just don't see how that's possible.
Yeah, Ben, we're talking history lessons here, but who reads history? Yeah. All right, we'll leave it right there. Ben Swann, always appreciate your insights.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.